Have you fully recovered from the joy of exposure equivalence? Are you ready to tackle something almost as challenging? All right. This is part 2 of class number 9 video for Art 149. This is all about HDR. And if you don't know what HDR means, that's why you're here. So let's talk a little bit about the DR part, which is dynamic range. And dynamic range is the range of tones from the darkest part to the brightest part that is visible at one time. So behind me, probably the darkest part is my shirt, my hair. The brightest part is the light up here, and everything in between. So that's the dynamic range of what you're looking at on screen right now. It's not, well, the bright is pretty bright, but the dark isn't really, really dark. So it's not a super big dynamic range. So the human eye has a dynamic range, and we measure dynamic range in stops of light. So stops of light, these are stops of light, like I just showed you in the exposure equivalent. So the human eye can go from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, up to 14 of these. And so it's got a pretty large dynamic range. And then most modern cameras to do about 10 stops of dynamic range. So a smaller portion than what our eyes can generally see. And that's one of the things that I think creates interest in photos, but sometimes I want that whole range. I want the bright brights and the dark darks at the same time. So here's, as if you've seen in the Sean Tucker video, here's another reminder of how dynamic range works. So for this image here, on the right is the white, the brightest part, and on the left is the black, the darkest part. And in between, we have 14 stops. Okay, 14 stops. Stops. Each of these blocks, square, they're not squares, boxes is a stop. So here's what our cameras have. Okay, here's what our cameras have. And in your default, so when you're in Aperture Priority, any of the auto modes, it's going to go with that middle part as its priority. It's not going to shift to the left or to the right for brighter or darker unless you tell it to. So, and if you do tell it to, so let's say I shift to the right, then obviously I've given up a lot of the mid darks to capture the bright stuff. So everything that's below a certain darkness level will just go to black. And it may be like my shirt would look totally black, even though, well, it is black, but it looks kind of a dark gray in this light. It would just go to black. No detail. I can go the other direction if the dark tones are the more important part of the image I'm creating. But then obviously I give up the highlights. So things that are even semi-bright would become just blown out, no detail highlights. And that's kind of happening up here with this lamp. There's a light bulb inside of there, but you can't really see it. It's just pure white. If I did that here, let's say, let me just do that real quick. So let's see. So let me turn this. Let's go. I was at 200 ISO. Let's go 1 stop, 2 stops, 3 stops more light. Let's go 4 because that's the dynamic range difference. Okay. There's 4 stops more light. Look at my great shirt. But look at, yeah, you can't see my face anymore. That's not good. So let's go back to where we started. And then let's go 4 stops less light. There's 4 stops less light. So now the lights in the background and the light in the lamp look better. They're not blown out. Trade-offs. So wouldn't it be nice if my camera would focus again? There we are. Wouldn't it be nice if we could have the best of both worlds? The bright brights and the dark darks. And the answer to that question is yes, it would be nice. So here's how we do that. That's where the H in HDR comes into play. HDR stands for high dynamic range. High dynamic range. And what we're doing with that is we're showing more of the exposure range by taking multiple photos and then combining them with software. We're going to take the same photo, But we're going to change the exposure in each of the multiple photos we're taking. We're going to take some that are brighter, some that are darker, and one that's just right at least. So HDR photos generally have at least 3 photos. You have the 0 one where the meter's at 0, and then you have usually some that are at least one that's brighter and at least one that's darker by at least +1, -1. I usually skip the plus and -1 if I only have 3 and just would say go to +2, -2. Okay, multiple exposures, and then software will combine them together. And I'll show you how to do this in Lightroom. All right, so HDR. So what we're doing again is combining those multiple exposures. And usually it's 3 to 7 photos. I'm going to show you, I have a video where I took some photos in here using HDR where I'll show you the settings to use and all that, how it works. And then again, we have software that will let us do the combination of the photos. And it's a process called tone mapping. And tone mapping takes some of the brights, some of the mids, some of the darks from each image, basically the best part of each exposure, and then combines them into one new one. So here's an example. So we go from -2 in the top left, and then we have a -1 photo, we have a 0 photo, the correct photo, +1, +2. And then we get to the combo image, which has good detail in the darks, which is the mountain and the trees, and then good detail in the sky, the bright parts, which are the clouds. So best of all worlds, okay, HDR. There's 2 basic ways to create an HDR image, and I'll show you that following this where I'll actually do the demo of this, but let's walk through the steps. So here's how you do the first of the 2 steps. And this is going to be a manual method of creating the different exposures. The 3 to 5 seems to be enough exposures. So the manual way, you will need a tripod. You will need some way that your camera doesn't move between the individual images, because you're going to be touching the camera and changing controls. So my suggestion for this is, if you want to be in automatic mode, is to do Aperture Priority mode. And then what we're going to use in addition to Aperture Priority is that awesome exposure compensation dial. An exposure compensation dial is going to help you move up and down here without even doing the math. Okay. So what I suggest for when you do the exposure compensation, and if you have a newer camera, I think you can easily just do 3 photos. 3 photos. Do one at 0, one at -2. So click, click, click till you get to -2 on your exposure meter. Or you go to +2, and I mean, you go to +2. So you'll have 3 photos. If you're doing 5, you can do -2, -1, 0, +1, +2. And that's what I'll show you in the video. So you can even do ±3. Yeah, there's lots of variations you can do on this. I suggest experimenting with your camera, see what gives you results you like the best. Okay? That's the manual method. It still goes pretty quick once you get fast at it, especially if you have a dedicated exposure compensation dial. You can just click, turn to -2, click, turn to +2, click, go back to 0, third click. Easy. All right. So that's the manual method. There is another easier, more awesome way, automatic way. What this, you don't necessarily need a tripod for this. It depends on how good you are at holding still for just about a second or so. But yeah, you don't have to have a tripod, but it's not required, not needed. So what you're going to use for this, you're going to use a camera setting called auto exposure bracketing. Auto exposure bracketing. And I'll get to a little bit more about that in a second. And you'll also probably have to change the drive mode on your camera, which is we've talked about a few classes ago. So you're going to change your drive mode to continuous. So as you hold the button down, you just have to hold it down once, and it'll take 3 to 5 photos as you designate all at once with 3 to 5 different exposures. It's pretty cool. Again, if you have a newer camera, just 3 photos is probably fine. -2, 0, +2. If you have a little bit older camera or an entry-level camera, you might do -2, -1, 0, +1, +2 if your camera does it. As you'll see in the video, the Canon Rebel that I have access to only does 3 photos, and it can do maximum -2 +2. So here's how to find out if your camera does this. If you don't know off the tippy top of your head if your camera will allow you to do this automatically. Just go to Google and search your camera name and then auto exposure bracketing. And it will tell you, give you instructions how to do this. Follow a link. The dummies.com website is usually pretty good for this. If you see a link from your camera manufacturer, that's probably a safe place to go as well. And if you want to come by Zoom time or send me an email, I will do what I can to try and give you a hand. Although it'd probably be easier on Zoom because we can do a video show and tell kind of thing. So that's a quick intro to auto exposure bracketing used for creating HDR photos. So I'm going to show you a live demo in here of creating the photos, what you need to do, the process using the Canon Rebel camera. So we'll cut to that next.
All right, today we're going to talk about HDR. HDR stands for High Dynamic Range. Covered the reasons for this in the presentation video, but we're going to take a look at a real world situation here in my office, looking out the window on a sunny afternoon. So what you're seeing, let's take a picture real quick, is this is the camera, what it wants to do with no intervention from me. So I'm going to do one click, and you'll see the room is really dark, exposed correctly pretty much for the beautiful outside. But the room and then over here is really dark, so it's not good. The camera can only capture a certain portion of everything that you and I can see with our eyes. So we're going to help it out by creating multiple exposures where we change the light values in each exposure. And there's 2 ways to do that. The first, the easy way, is called auto exposure bracketing. And the way to find out if your camera does that, just do a jump over to Google, take a look, and enter your camera name and the words, 3 words, auto exposure bracketing. And it should give you instructions if your camera does this. And if your camera does, it's awesome because it makes everything so much easier. So I'm going to show you how to set it up in this camera. So on this camera, the way you set it up is I go into my menu and I go to the menu that has that, and it's Expo Comp /AEB. I think that's Canon's language for this. So I'm going to click on that. And then what you see here, here's what you have the options of. This camera will not let you choose how many photos you get when you auto exposure bracket. You just get 3. Some cameras give you the option to choose how many photos you take. This one only has 3. So the only setting you're going to change here on this Canon, which is the Rebel T5i, is the range of the exposures. The range of the exposure. So I'm going to set that to be as wide as it will go, and the widest it will go is +2 to -2. So it'll create 3 photos. One will be at -2, one will be at 0, and one will be at +2. The other thing you need to do to enable this then is to go into your menu and choose your drive mode, and you want to go over to continuous shooting. So there's 2 things to do: turn on auto exposure bracketing, then turn on the drive modes. All right, so we should get a total of 3 photos with 1 click, and they should be 3 different exposures each. Here we go. So there we are. So I'm going to hit the play button so you can see the 3 photos, and I'll show them to you on the screen too. There's +2, there's -2, and there's 0. So we've got 3 different exposures. This one is good for the highlights, this one is good for the shadows, and this one, the 0, is good for the mids. So that's auto exposure bracketing. If your camera does this, you really don't need to use a tripod to take these photos. Just hold semi-steady, and the software that we're going to use, which is Lightroom, can stitch these together. Let me show you how to do this when if your camera doesn't have auto exposure bracketing, Or if you want more than 3 photos, if your camera only does 3, and you want a wider range than ±2. So we're going to do this manually. All right, so we're going to do manual exposure bracketing this time. I want to do a total of 7 photos from -5 to +5. So I'll do -5, -3, -1, 0, +1, +3, +5. In order to do that on this Canon camera, I have to make sure that my auto exposure bracketing is set to back to 0. It's turned off basically, and the drive mode is set back to single photo. I'm in Aperture Priority. I already did this once and discovered that at f5 that I was at, when I wanted to go to +5, it wouldn't go there because it didn't have a fast enough shutter speed. So I'm going to go to f16, so a small aperture in this setting, and that'll let me have the latitude of exposure I need from +5 to -5. All right, so here we go. So here's the first photo at 0. Click, there we go. So now I'm going to go to -1, and we're going to take another photo. And we'll go -3, getting darker, protecting the highlights. Then we'll go to -5. Still kind of yelling at me. I'm not sure why this exposure thing is blinking at me, but we'll take the picture anyway. Super dark. All right, so back to the plus side now. We're going to go plus. So obviously, if you're doing this manually, you do need a tripod because you're moving the camera so much with the controls you're using. Here's +1. Here's +3. Shutter speeds are getting pretty long. And let's go to +5. 1 minute, 1 second, 1.6 seconds is what this is going to be. Here we go. Ready? All right, really bright. So let's review those really quickly in camera, then I'll show them to you on screen. So there's +5, +3, +1. That's minus, wait, that's minus, oh, that's +1. I don't know what it's doing. Anyway, I'll show them to you on screen. All right, so that is HDR, high dynamic range, using your camera to take multiple exposures at different exposure settings so you get different brightness values, so you capture the full tonal range that your eye can see, but your camera can't see. And then you combine it in software, the images together, and you get this magical combination of the best of the highlights, the darks, and the midtones. I'll show you that in a minute.